Reactor online. Sensors online. Weapons online. All systems nominal.
Hey everyone, B1B Flyer here. In this video, I'm going to show you how undercoats can affect the appearance of speed paints. Specifically, I'll show the results with the 5 colors offered in the upcoming Battletech Paint Starter Set. Before I go any further, I didn't mention in my starter set unboxing video that I was not compensated by Army Painter or Catalyst to create these videos. With that out of the way, let's go to work. In order to show a variety of undercoat options but also limit the amount of models needed for this demonstration, I chose 6 different paints and then painted major sections of each mech. I painted these consistently for each speed paint color, so this breakout of what color was used in each section applies to every model. The selection of colors was based mostly on what I've used before in some of my videos with contrast paints, as well as their easily found comparable colors regardless of paint manufacturer. I use a lot of Vallejo paints, but grays and light browns and cream colors are easily had in any paint line. I'll have the full list of paints I used in the description below, as well as the original names for each of the speed paint colors since they're relabeled speed paints that Army Painter already offers. For each model, I started with the Army Painter's included white brush-on primer and completed at least 2 or 3 thinned coats before applying any of the other colors. I clipped the images of the instructions from the Army Painter included in the box, and while it says to thin a bit with water and apply 2 coats, I would argue it's worth your time to do more if you're limited to using a brush-on primer. I found I needed about 4 or 5 thinned coats to get the white primer to appear smooth on its own over the gray plastic. This is very important to note because smooth, even coverage of the undercoat has a significant impact on the appearance after the speed paint is applied. Let that primer dry completely, especially in the recesses, as I think I had an issue with uncured primer or paint on one of the models, which I'll discuss later. After the primer was dry, I used the selected colors and applied at least 2 thinned coats of each to achieve a smooth finish. Time for the speed paints. I'll cover each individually and share my process and any tips or concerns I came across during my testing. I'm going to start with the Deviant Green, and I'll be trying out the Army Painter Monster Synthetic Brush with it for the first time as well. Speed paints are just like contrast paints and definitely need to be shaken well, so make sure you do that every time. I debated showing this color test first, and the reason is that the results were not what I was hoping for. I applied the paint more carefully than I usually do in my videos, for a few reasons. I'm not used to this brush yet, and I don't want it to make bubbles if I go too quickly. Next, not everyone paints the same speed as I do, and if you do too much at once, you risk having it dry in areas before you can continue the wet area, which can cause uneven pigment areas and pool lines. And finally, I'm making sure I get a feel for this paint consistency as I take my time section by section. In the following color tests, you'll see me much more aggressively apply the paint, and I'll be using a sable hair brush as I found it to be more of my preference. After letting the paint dry for a couple hours, I took still photos of each model at 4 angles to show you what the colors look like over each undercoat. You can definitely see the uneven coverage I have in several areas, and I believe this is slightly due to the consistency of the paint, resulting in what mainly look like brush strokes. But what I think is the main factor is the even application of the undercoat. I think the bone white and dark gray made the most difference in their results outside of the white, but unfortunately the uneven coverage overshadows most of the results. Of note, the 2 green colors out of the 5 speed paints seem to be slightly thicker than the others, and if I had to guess, it is possibly likely why I got some less than even coverage. In a comparison to the Phoenix Hawk I painted prior to this, the variables were that I used an airbrush to apply white primer, and I added a slight amount of medium or water to both of the greens before painting. I'll look into how to prevent this more when I make specific how to paint videos for Davion Green as well as the other colors. Next up is the Liao Green on the Cataphract. After trying out that synthetic brush, I'm switching to a number 4 sable brush that I like to use for washes. It seems to keep the application smooth over the miniature, but I still think achieving an even undercoat has more of an impact on the results when dry. As always, make sure you shake the speed paint well beforehand. As I mentioned earlier, I'm being much more aggressive when applying the paint this heavily. This is fine to do if you're prepared to move and pull the paint on the model with your brush and then wick away pooling as needed. Using a bit less, especially if you're just learning to paint miniatures, will help you control the pace. Before I get to the still shots, I need to mention a mistake I made while undercoating. I typically don't use brush-on primer with the exception of touch-ups or repairs. What I did when applying the primer was thin it slightly with water as recommended by Army Painter, but I'm willing to bet I didn't let it fully dry between layers. I was also a bit rushed when applying the Actuator metal layers, and the two coats were likely again not fully dry, or the primer beneath was not, so the end result will be some cracking or crazing in the green. This is entirely my fault for rushing to get the video made, but I wanted to let everyone know so that you can learn from my mistake. If you need to dry more quickly, consider a fan or a hairdryer on low heat to speed things along. This green had much better results overall, but I still noticed some brush strokes in a few areas, and again I attribute that mainly to the undercoat, but also possibly needing a little bit of thinning while applying. Moving on to Karita Red, this one was more of a surprise to me than I had anticipated. Having seen the example photos in the Army Painter tutorial, I was expecting something similar, but was pleasantly surprised at the intensity and variation over the undercoats. I will mention that if you let this red pool up too much in the deep cracks or armor grooves, it will look almost black, so be vigilant as you work your way down to the lower areas of the model, since gravity will be assisting in the paint settling in areas you don't want. Just use a paper towel and unload the excess until it isn't pooling up. I have another issue to bring up before the photos, and that's that despite my best efforts, I could not get this red to show its true red saturation in my lightbox. I'm by no means a photography expert, but to no avail I could not adjust my settings to prevent this model from looking a bit faded and approaching an orange hue. Here's a pic of the model on my desk under a different light that shows a much more intense red than what you're about to see in the comparison photos. I suggest looking up Speedpaint color reviews to see a more accurate color over white primer. Camera issues aside, this is a great result with a nice impact made by the undercoats on a few colors. The dark gray and metallic really have some potential to do some fun things. I don't think the ivory or bone were noticeably different from the white. Time for Steiner Blue. Shake your paint bottle and get that Atlas Scout mech painted. There wasn't anything noteworthy about the blue speed paint outside of the normal pooling awareness. It did get me thinking about how to try a Laren guard scheme while using speed paints, since they tend to creep and flow more through capillary action than contrast paints do. I've got some time to plan it out, and I'll tackle that topic in the upcoming dedicated Steiner Blue tutorial. Having the largest areas of the test models, I was hoping it would reveal the subtle differences in the results, and I think that's what was achieved. Of note, I intentionally took my finger and tried to wipe away the speed paint on the front of the left torso, and you can see that white undercoat revealed here. Just like contrast paints, washes, and glazes, thin paint on a raised sharp edge is always the weakest adhering and needs protection from a varnish if they're to be handled for gaming or transport. More on that later, as you can see the blue differences are fairly unique with the exception of the bone white, basically looking like a white primer with a possibly slightly warmer tone, but not worth the effort in my opinion. Last but not least, Merrick Purple. Shake, apply, Marik militia time. You get the idea. Like the blue and the red, the purple goes on very well and seemed to be the ideal consistency to get solid coverage. I know folks have mentioned the bottle label looks like it's more on the pink spectrum, but it's a bit exaggerated. This purple over white primer can read as pink under photo lighting on the raised edges, but I have some solutions for that I'll share later in the video. This is one of the better colors for finding an option that suits your idea of Marik militia purple. I really like the darker gray and the ivory results as you eliminate any pink hues and only straight and magenta at the edges. I've already decided the tutorial I make for the Marik militia will go over the ivory base. The purple had only some slight uneven brush strokes when dry. I know it applies very well over airbrushed dark and light gray primers since the Phoenix Hot color test came out with some very nice results in this comparison shot. That wraps up the basic undercoat color tests, so you can all make more informed decisions on what you want to do with your models when using these speed paints. If you're a fan of the channel and have seen my previous contrast paint videos, you know I typically expand a bit from just the one coat and done method as intended, because I like to show what a little bit of extra effort and technique can do to drastically change the look of the finished miniature. After the paint was cured overnight, I used a makeup brush to dry brush Stonewall gray over each color. Here's the side-by-side before and after for each one. Ordinarily, I would use some different colors, but I wanted to be consistent in these and show what just some light gray can do to bring an edge highlight to the shadows and surface variation the speed paint provides. I was fairly aggressive, so there's a weathered appearance on some of the surfaces, but I really feel it enhanced each color by adding depth. I did use a matte varnish to seal them all up as well and protect the speed paint from reactivation for any future further work. The great thing about this is the freedom of choice to find the style that you like and give it a try. Here's my final thoughts on these test models. I really liked the intensity of color on several undercoats, so don't limit yourself to just a basic white. Make sure the undercoat is as smooth as possible. I know not everyone can use a rattle can primer or has the need for an airbrush, but if you have either of those options available to you, I would try those over just the standard brush-on primer. If you brush prime, make sure to thin the primer and let each coat dry thoroughly. I know 2 or 3 coats still showed some of the gray streaks from the plastic beneath, so consider more coats or even just a regular white paint over the first couple primer coats. I think a bit of consistency adjustment will help with the smoother coverage, especially with the greens, but keep in mind that thinning will increase the transparency of the color, which will result in a lighter final color and even thinner coverage on the edges. Speaking of edges, I completely recommend spray varnishing your models after the speed paint is dry. It locks in your finish, prevents reactivation and wear from handling, and you can always use a brush-on varnish of your choice when you're finished over the top. I've never had a problem with the Rust-Oleum 2X or Krylon Clear in satin, semi-gloss, or gloss finishes living in the southeastern US. These paints were designed for mass army painting in an assembly line style. The concerns brought on by those saying that speed paint drying time, extra steps to varnish or prevent reactivation, any of the others are applicable if you're only painting one or a handful of models. I suggest you take a look at another review of the speed paint set from our channel partner Death from Above Wargaming. The link will be at the end of the video, as well as some of the website and video reviews of speed paints in general that I've linked in the description below. They'll help you make the decision best for you on color choice, methods, and if this new box set is the right product for you overall. Finally, Army Painter just announced Speed Paint 2.0 and a new expanded color range for their updated speed paint line. As far as I know, these Battletech speed paints will not be a part of that new formula released that is supposed to lock in and prevent any reactivation after approximately 2 hours of cure time. I've linked to that video in the description as well. That's all for me now. I'll hand it over to Tex.
We certainly hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe and leave your questions or comments below. Follow us on Facebook at Battletech Camo Specs Online. Check out our website at camospecs.com. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time. Shutdown sequence initiated.